Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Kevin. If you don't recognize me, I'm the web guy for Stengel Chapter, and we'd like to welcome Dan Joseph, who has a new book that he's going to tell us about. I'm sure you've already looked at it. There you go. And I'm just going to pass the microphone over to him right now.
Oh,
Take
okay.
it away.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Like Kevin said, my name is Dan Joseph. I am the author of this new book, Baseball's Greatest What If, the story and tragedy of the Brooklyn Dodgers' Pistol Pete Reiser. I just want to quickly get in a quick plug. I wrote one other New York baseball-related book, Last Ride of the Iron Horse, about Lou Gehrig's 1938 season, his last full year in the Yankee lineup. We can talk about that later if you have any questions or comments about that. But the new one is the Pete Reiser book, and I just want to talk a little bit about why I wrote about him, and then get into his life and career a little bit. I'm sure everybody here knows Reiser was a should-have-been superstar for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the early 1940s. He had a spectacular first full year in the majors, 1941. He led the National League in batting in about 8 or 10 other categories, some counted at the time, some only years later. The Dodgers won their first pennant in 21 years. And Reiser was really, not only was he a star on the field, he was on his way to becoming sort of a national celebrity. He was on some of the big radio shows. He was profiled in magazines like Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post. Mid-season 1942, he was hitting .360, leading both leagues in hitting. But he was known for having one of the greatest skill sets that baseball had ever seen. Not only was he a great hitter, he was blindingly fast, especially going down to first base. He was a very good glove in center field. He had a rocket arm, and he had a drive that no one had ever seen. That drive, however, was his flaw in a way. He had such a laser beam focus on the game that he couldn't sense any danger, especially in the outfield. He ran into his teammates several times. Early in 1941, he was crowding the plate and he got hit in the cheek with a pitch ball from Ike Pearson with the Phillies. And then on July 19th, 1942, the Dodgers were in St. Louis. They had a 7-game lead in the National League. They were in a 12-inning game with the Cardinals. And Enos Slaughter of the Cardinals hit a long fly ball to deep center field. Reiser, with his normal, kind of blinders on, he just ran after the ball, didn't realize the wall was coming up, and he crashed headfirst into the wall. He was taken off the field, diagnosed with a concussion, and the doctor told him, you need to stay in bed for a few days, don't go rushing back. But Reiser was so intent on playing that he ignored doctor's orders. The very next day, he left the hospital in St. Louis, got on a train, went back to Brooklyn, and got back in the lineup against some people's better judgment about 6 days later. The rest of the 42 season, his batting average dropped from about .360 down to .310. The Dodgers blew a 10-game lead and lost the pennant, and Reiser, to the end of his life, kind of blamed himself because he shouldn't have been playing. After that, like so many other players, he got drafted in 1943. He spent 3 years playing ball for the Army, was not really physically fit for the Army, but because he had the concussions and several other injuries, but there was a feeling in the country that ball players, if they were healthy enough to play major league ball or even minor league ball, they were certainly healthy enough to serve their country, spend time in the service. So for 3 years, he played Army ball in Kansas and Louisiana and Virginia. And so intense was his desire of playing ball, even for Army teams, even before crowds of like 500 or 1,000 soldiers maybe. He actually injured himself in 1945. He was going after another fly ball. He ran through, they didn't have a real wall covering the outfield. What they had was a hedge. And he ran through the hedge. On the other side of the hedge was a ditch. He fell into the ditch and he injured his right shoulder, his throwing arm. Next spring training, he came back to the Dodgers, and Leo DeRocher was trying him, the Dodgers manager was trying him out at third base. And he made a long throw across the infield and separated his shoulder. The way it worked in those days was, the doctors couldn't, they took an x-ray, they saw his shoulder was separated, but the Dodgers didn't want him to have surgery. I guess they regarded it as too chancy. So he played the entire 1946 season with a separated shoulder. He also hit the wall 2 more times that season, got more concussions. And at the end of the season, when he was on first base and playing with a pulled hamstring, the Dodgers flashed in the steal sign. He took a lead off first base, and there was a pickoff throw. He tried to get back to first, and he broke his ankle sliding into first. You can see that, this was a guy who just didn't seem to recognize his own limitations. And he was playing for a team and a manager, Leo DeRocher, who also didn't recognize his limitations, physical limitations. So 47, he comes back again. He's playing with a kind of a sore ankle, but he's doing okay. And on June 4th of that year, the Dodgers were playing in Ebbets Field, and Cully Ricard, who's kind of a journeyman outfielder for the Pirates, hit a ball to straight center field. Reiser, again, chased after the ball, ignored warnings from his own teammates. Wall coming up, look out, look out. Ignored, the fans were shouting at him, look out, look out. He didn't hear it. Crashed into the wall. This time, it was more serious. He was only diagnosed with a concussion, but let me back up. Before that, he was taken to the clubhouse and a priest was called because he was bleeding from his head. Priest was called and he was given the last rites in the Dodger clubhouse. It didn't turn out to be that serious. He woke up, smoked a cigarette, and was taken to the Swedish hospital, I think it was, in Brooklyn. And this time he stayed there for 4 days, didn't ignore doctor's orders, and sat out about 5 weeks of the season, came back, hit 360 down the stretch as the Dodgers won the pennant in 47. Third game of the World Series, he's trying to steal second. He gets thrown out and he breaks his ankle sliding into second base. In 46, he had broken his left ankle. This one was his right ankle. So he goes to the hospital. Doctor tells him it's broken, but Reiser tells the doctor, don't tell anybody. Just tell them it's a bad sprain. Just tape it up. Tell them it's a bad sprain. The next day, the Yankees are playing the Dodgers, 4th game of the series. This is the famous game where Bill Bevins of the Yankees had a no-hitter going into the 9th inning. He walked one guy in the 9th, and Bert Shotton, the Dodgers manager that year, sent Reiser up to pinch hit, even though he had a broken ankle. His rationale being he needed a left-handed hitter at that moment, and Reiser was able to stand. And Reiser, at least in theory, could still swing. And the Yankees paid Reiser the ultimate tribute. Even though he was clearly limping and at minimum had a bad sprain of his ankle, they intentionally walked him. And people questioned that play at the time, and players like Joe DiMaggio questioned it for decades after. Reiser trotted down to first base, or limped down to first base, and the Dodgers sent in a pinch runner, and then Cookie Lavagetto hit his famous double to right field, broke up a no-hitter, scored 2 runs, and the Dodgers won the game. That was kind of Pete's last hurrah. In 48, he was so badly beat up, he could only play, once or twice a week, mostly in pinch hitting roles. The Dodgers got rid of him after that year, partially because he was so beat up, and partially because he had been feuding with Branch Rickey, the Dodgers GM, for a few years over salary and what Pete considered the callous treatment from the Dodgers. They wouldn't let him get surgery, and they were telling him to get back out on the field when he couldn't play. He kind of engineered his own trade to the Boston Braves. He spent the last 4 years in the majors kind of bouncing from the Braves to the Pirates to the Cleveland Indians. And he had to retire at age 33, lifetime batting average of 295. He came back to the game though a few years later. He tried selling autos in St. Louis, his hometown. That didn't work out. He was working as a carpenter. He was dying to get back into baseball. The Dodgers offered a managerial position in their Class D club in Thomasville, Georgia. And Pete was so desperate to get back in, he accepted. Even though his wife and his two daughters came down to join him there. He spent 5 years riding the buses in the minor leagues. Came back to the majors with the Dodgers as a batting coach in 1960, now in Los Angeles. And then spent a long career in the majors as a coach, usually with Leo DeRocher somewhere nearby. DeRocher was the Dodgers coach, and then hired him when DeRocher was hired as the Cubs manager. Pete was there for the great collapse of 1969. And one of the things that I found out writing the book was that Pete predicted, I think in June of 69, that the Cubs were not as good as they seemed and were prone to a collapse later in the season. 70s, he coached some more for the Cubs, and then he became a scout, mostly in Southern California. And 1980, he had been a heavy smoker over the years, had a couple heart attacks. He died in 1981 only at the age of 62. A little bit of a sad ending to his career. But reporters would ask him, if you could go back and play your career over, as a player, not a coach, would you do it the same way? And the logical answer would be, of course, I wouldn't run into all these walls. But Pete insisted to the end of his life that he could play no other way. He had to play all out all the time, no restraint, or he said he couldn't have made it to the major leagues. And it's interesting though, I talked to his daughter for this book. His daughter is still alive, living in California. And she said that behind the scenes, he may have still had some regrets. He used to tell her, you get old too soon and smart too late. And she thought that was a life lesson that he was trying to impart to her. So that's kind of the overview of Pete's career. I'd like to, actually, I'll pause here. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Perry Barber? I'm not sure how do I?
Hi there.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Hi. Hi, Dan. Thanks. I mean, yeah.
I don't think we can hear you. Wait.
I can hear her.
Yeah, my internet connection sometimes is not great. Am I coming through?
I hear clearly.
Yeah, loud and clear here too.
Mute. I'm unmuted, right?
Kevin, could you
I can hear her. Dan, there's a setting on the bottom that you have to maybe turn on to unmute.
Oops. Oh, shit. Oh,
Can you hear
for him
Dan,
to
can you
unmute
hear
me,
me?
you mean?
I can hear her fine.
Everybody else can hear me except for Dan.
You can also
right?
type in the question maybe.
It's a little long. He just made a comment about Pete Reiser feeling guilty that his batting average plummeted in 1942, the first time he ran into a wall. And I was looking at the statistics for his teammates that year. And first of all, they didn't drop out of first place until September, well after he had come back from his injury. And second of all, nobody else on that team batted anything close to 300, except for, who was it? One player, not Joe Medwick, somebody. Anyway, only one other guy batted 300 on the team. And I'm wondering, did he feel guilty because he thought that he hadn't carried his weight? Or did he feel guilty that he came back too soon from his injury and just wasn't feeling right the whole time? Because that's a heavy load to bear, looking at it objectively. Do you know? Do you happen to know? Or was Dan ever able to hear me? Does anybody else know?
I don't think
can hear
Dan.
you.
Okay.
I don't want to interrupt, but I don't think Dan has his audio on. There's a
Dan?
setting. I don't know how to tell him to turn it on.
Dan, are you still not able to hear me? Still not able to hear me. Okay, well then somebody else talk to him. I was just curious. Catholic guilt and all that,
Folks, I'm sorry, I can't hear anybody.
Anybody? Ooh. Huh.
I should have gotten Dan's cell phone number so I could text him to say, turn your audio on.
Maybe we can just tell him that in chat.
He's talking.
Now we can't hear him. Probably muted. He's
Yeah, he has to unmute.
There. Am I okay now? Can you hear me now?
I hear you. You I hear hear me? you. You hear Mark?
I can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I am sorry about that.
Dan, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
All right.
Hey, we could do a Verizon commercial. Can you hear me now?
All right, what
Does
was your
anybody
question?
mind if I ask my question again?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. In 1942, you mentioned that Pete Reiser had stated his feelings of guilt about the fact that his batting average had plummeted so precipitously. But when I was looking at the stats for the rest of his teammates that season, none of them, except for one other, batted anywhere close to 300. Most of them were in the 250s, 260s. And they didn't even lose first place until September, which was well after he'd come back from that injury. So I'm wondering what exactly he felt guilty about. It's sort of interesting that he would, shoulder that burden of not having won the pennant and somehow think it was his fault when nobody else was really doing much better than he was anyway. You know what I mean?
Well, it's in 1941-42, and also for maybe a year or two after the war, he was considered sort of the driver of the Dodger offense. He was by far the best hitter, the best overall player. And like I said, he was hitting 360 in July, or 356, I think. And without him in the lineup, the Dodgers were an offensively challenged team.
Okay.
So
yeah, obviously.
I mean, a guy named Joe Medwick, he had been off to a very hot start that year, but he also faded in the second half.
Right.
And Reiser he felt that it was, he was the guy who was supposed to take them to the World Series, and that's why he got back in there so quickly right after he had the concussion. And when he looked back, he realized he should not have been playing. He should have at least let someone who had a chance to hit well and field well play center field and be in the number 3 spot in the lineup. That was his regular spot. But he was determined to try. And I think from the injury onward, he was a 240 hitter for the rest of the season. And he felt that the Dodgers had a replacement, a guy named Augie Gallon or Galan, who was a competent major league hitter. He would have some seasons hitting 300 later on, and he felt like maybe the Dodgers should have played Gallon instead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering, I mean, to me, it's so sad that he would, feel that guilty about something he shouldn't have, along with the injury to begin with. It's just very sad.
Yeah, yeah. So, any other questions?
And
comments?
Dan, I was under the impression that he came up as an infielder and they converted him to outfield. Is that correct?
Yeah, when he started in the minors, he was a shortstop. By his own admission, he made it scary to sit behind first base because his arm was so inaccurate. And then in 1940, the Dodgers acquired a shortstop named Pee Wee Reese.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found in writing the book is after Reese had his first workout in spring training 1940, and he was dashing to his left and dashing to his right and picking up all the ground balls. The next day, the Dodgers announced that Reiser was going to be made an outfielder. Anything else?
Dan?
Yes.
Yeah. Really interesting about 1947 with the Lavagetto hit that I always wondered why Reiser was pinch run for. And you answered that question. He had played in 5 games in that World Series, but he hurt the ankle, I guess, in game 4 or just prior to that. So that question. And then when I look at 1941, that incredible year that he had, which was the same year that Williams and DiMaggio had their amazing years. And Reiser was right in there. He led the league in doubles and RBI and batting average in the same year that Williams and DiMaggio. He was only 22 years old. So you really wonder what kind of career he would have had. They all had to deal with World War II. So you can't really use that as, but if something happened to him, and I guess it was the banging into the walls and the concussions, and it just. But even as late as his next to last year, when I was looking at some of his stats, he still led the league in stolen bases, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, in 41 and 42. Now, of course, DiMaggio and Williams, that's sort of like the signature years. 41 was the signature year for both DiMaggio and Williams. Williams hit 406, and DiMaggio had his 56 game hitting streak. But it was funny. It was not hard to find people who thought Reiser was maybe not quite as good as Joe DiMaggio overall, but certainly within the same realm, not that far off, and maybe in a year or two would become DiMaggio's equal.
How old was DiMaggio in that year? Do you know?
DiMaggio was 27 or 26. I think he turned 27 later in the year.
So Reiser was 5 years younger.
Right. Reiser was 22. And Reiser, one thing, he was considerably smaller than DiMaggio. DiMaggio, I think, was 6'2", maybe 205 pounds, something like that. Reiser was listed at 5'10", 180, although in reality, I think he was a little smaller. If you see him in pictures standing next to Pee Wee Reese, who was 5'10", he's definitely a little shorter. And his weight, I found articles where he routinely said his ideal playing weight was like 170 or 175. So he was not a big guy. He wasn't Jose Altuve, but he was not a big guy. And that he could have been a superstar on the level of DiMaggio or Stan Musial. But first he had the collisions, and he tried to play through. He was playing with a separated shoulder. He played the entire 1946 season with a separated shoulder.
Excuse me a second, that the people you mentioned, including Musial, none of them stole bases.
No.
DiMaggio didn't steal bases. Williams, and neither did Reiser stole bases. He didn't have home runs like them. He stole bases.
Reiser, I forgot to mention, in 1946, he stole home 7 times. And these weren't double steals where, the catcher threw it down to second and then Reiser dashed home. These were straight steals of home in 46. And he also hit 3 inside the park home runs that season. And there were also a couple times where he was standing on third and he was threatening to steal home, and the pitcher got so unraveled that one guy committed a balk and one guy hit the batter and gave Reiser the free run. He was just electric on the field, but especially on the bases.
I've never seen film of him. I've never seen film of him playing.
I have a video, which if I can mount the technical challenges, I'll play at the end of our session tonight. It has a little bit of film in there, and you can see how fast he is. There's not much film, but there is a little bit. Anything else? Anyone?
Yes, Dan, the year he stole home 7 times, was he thrown out on any of them?
Yeah, he was thrown out 4 times.
Okay.
One time in Chicago, he claimed that the umpire, lifted his hand and said, "You're out," but then under his breath said, "No, wait, you're safe." But the ump had already decided, "No, I already called you out, so you're out." He always insisted it should have been 8 times.
Right.
Yeah.
Dan, if I understood you correctly, at one point there, when toward the end of his time with the Dodgers, he became upset that the Dodgers would not approve medical care.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't that sort of inconsistent with his attitude throughout his career, that he rejected injury, the reality of injuries?
It was consistent, I think, up until that point in his career. In 42, the doctor told him, "You need to stay in bed." After he crashed into the wall at Sportsman Park, said, "You need to stay in bed." And of course, he got out of bed, hopped the train to Brooklyn, and was taking batting practice 3 days later, and jumped right back in the lineup. And then in 46, he did the same thing. He hit the wall at Ebbets Field, got a concussion, was back like a week later. But I think after the 46 season, he'd played a whole year with this throbbing pain in his shoulder. And I think by that point in his career, he was starting to wise up and began to think maybe this going at all costs approach wasn't working for him. So he did demand that the Dodgers, give him the surgery or allow him to get the surgery. And he actually had a phone call with Branch Rickey Jr., Branch Rickey's son, who was the head of scouting, I think, for the Dodgers or some other front office position. And Branch Rickey Jr. tried to talk him out of it. He said, "You can play ball now as you are with your injured shoulder. If you have surgery, who knows what will happen?" And of course, surgery in 1946 for something like a separated shoulder, it wasn't the dark ages, but it wasn't nearly as advanced as it would be a few decades later. So maybe the Dodgers' mindset wasn't entirely wrong for that time,
Yes.
but he did insist on the surgery. And then after he hit the wall in 47, he did give himself 5 or 6 weeks to rest. So I think as he got older and got more banged up, he became more cautious.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I will continue.
Dan?
Oh, sure. Yes.
I just want to mention if you look on the bottom of your screen, there's a chat button. One
Yeah.
or two people may have asked questions just via chat.
Let me see. Somebody asked if he experimented with switch hitting, and Reiser was a natural righty, but he discovered sometime when he was in the minor leagues that if he batted from the left side, he was closer to first base and could use his speed to get more infield hits. And so he switched over. He became a lefty. Occasionally, he would switch back to righty, but the Dodgers didn't like him to do that because he was, he won the batting title hitting lefty, so why mess up a good thing? I suppose I should mention here also that he was an ambidextrous thrower. Not that the left side was as good as the right side. In games, he always threw from the right. And in interviews, he claimed to have thrown lefty maybe in some minor league games or something like that. I actually researched this for the book, and I didn't find any evidence that he threw lefty in a game. But apparently, it was like a party trick. He could throw hard with his left hand, just not with the same accuracy as with his right. So, let's see if there are any others. Okay. Well, if no one has any other questions, I'll go on. One of the reasons I wanted to write this book was to find out what drove Pete to become not just a great player, but drove him with such intensity when he played. So I got into his background a little bit. His father was a minor league player, briefly. He played Class D ball in 1908 with a team in Argenta, Arkansas. It was very short-lived. He lasted like 2 weeks in the minor leagues, and then the team sent him home. But the father had a passion for baseball and spent countless hours playing with Pete. And Pete was playing with older kids, when he was like 9, 10 years old, partially because of the dad, and then partially because of an older brother, Mike Reiser. Pete always described his brother as a better player than him. And he said that Mike signed with the Yankees when he was 17 years old. I looked for evidence. I didn't find any of that. The reason we never heard about Mike Reiser was that in 1931, he caught scarlet fever and died at the age of 17. And Pete always traced his intensity back to his older brother, because he was always because he was playing in games with his older brother. Pete was like 10 and his brother was 15. But the older brother would say, the other kids would ask Mike, what's this little kid doing here? And Mike said, no, he'll show you. So he was playing way up from an early age. And he signed that he grew up in St. Louis, in a kind of a poor section of the city. The Cardinals reportedly started scouting him when he was 12. And the Cardinals chief scout, a man named Charlie Barrett, signed him when he was only about 15 years old. Now, Pete didn't go straight to the minors. He was really too young. So the scouts took him across the country as Charlie Barrett was making the rounds of the Cardinals minor league teams. He took Pete along with him, and Pete would kind of work out with the teams. Finally, he joined the Cardinals minor league system in 1937 in Class D ball. Only spent 1 year with the Cardinals, though. In the spring of 38, Commissioner Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis freed 91 players from the Cardinals farm system, including Pete Reiser. Now, why would he do this? Landis believed that the Cardinals were hoarding players. And statistically, it's pretty, I think it's true. The Cardinals at one time had 31 minor league teams and had more than 700 players under contract. And Landis, he didn't like the idea of all these minor league teams belonging to a major league team. And he didn't like the fact that the Cardinals controlled 2 teams in some leagues. He thought this was killing competition. So he released 91 players and said that they could not sign with their team for the next 3 years, sign with the Cardinals for the next 3 years. So the Cardinals hatched a scheme with a guy named Ted McGrew, who was the Dodgers chief scout. They made a gentleman's agreement where Reiser would play in the Cardinal farm system for 3 years, and then he would be traded or sold. I'm sorry, he would play in the Dodger farm system for 3 years and then be sold or traded back to the Cardinals. The problem with this was that in the spring of 1939, Pete kind of talked his way into the major league camp, the Dodgers major league camp, and proceeded to, DeRocher put him in a couple games, and Reiser got on base his first 11 times up. He got 8 hits and 3 walks. So this attracted, the entire New York press went crazy. Like, who is this kid? Because he had just jumped from Class A ball all the way up to the major leagues. The Dodgers did send him back down to the minors, and he spent all of 39 and part of 1940. But in 1940, he was hitting 378 in Class A ball still. The Dodgers were trying to keep him low. And reporters were asking, what is this kid doing down in Class A ball? Why isn't he up with the Dodgers? And so the Dodgers could not trade him back to the Cardinals. There would have been too much ridicule and outrage. And also, at that point, it probably would have caught Judge Landis's attention, what they were doing. So the Dodgers bought Joe Medwick from the Cardinals. Medwick was a former Triple Crown winner by this point. And they paid the Cardinals $132,000. Now, supposedly that was for Medwick, but in reality, at least some of that money was to compensate the Cardinals for Reiser. And I talked to a sports psychologist for the book, and we were talking about why, again, going back to why Pete was so intense, and he thought maybe part of the problem was that his arrival in the major leagues had been delayed, had been artificially pushed back by these shenanigans between the Dodgers and the Cardinals. There's a chapter in the book. Chapter 5 or 6, it's called A Wild and Frightening Beauty. And it's all about why Pete challenged the walls and why he was so intense. Jimmy Cannon, who was a great New York sports writer, suggested that Pete blocked out everything when he was going after a fly ball. He likened it to a form of artistry. It was like a painter or a great writer who was just in the zone and going to accomplish his goal, even if he was going to kill himself trying to do it. I lost my train of thought. So the psychologist said, it traced it back to either the brother or maybe the delayed arrival in the majors, but Pete himself always said that he just couldn't play any other way. He just was so, he saw a ball, he had to go get it. If his leg was throbbing, if his shoulder was throbbing, he had to keep playing. He just couldn't do it any other way. I wanted to talk a little bit about his time in the service during the war. There's a chapter on that in the book as well. Something like 400, 500 major league players spent time in the service during the war, and they all did it very patriotically. No one was really questioning the need for all these players to be drafted. But Pete was not a happy man during the war. He, unlike DiMaggio, unlike Ted Williams, he'd only played a couple of years in the majors, and he had just started to make big money. And when I say big money, I mean $10,000 a year. Not many players got 5-figure salaries in 1942, but Joe DiMaggio was getting like 40,000, and Ted Williams was getting 30,000. These were guys he was compared to, but he was getting much less money. And then he had to spend 3 years in the Army getting $50 a month. And in the book, I found this letter that Pete wrote to Branch Rickey during the war, basically saying, I've been in the service 3 years, and could I get a little financial help? And the Dodgers did advance him some money during 1944, yeah. But then when Reiser wrote again for more help in 1945, Branch Rickey wrote a very severe, nasty letter back to him, accusing Reiser of heavy drinking and wasting his talent. And I have to say, I did not find any evidence that this was true, that Reiser was like a heavy drinker, and that you hear sometimes about players not taking care of themselves and kind of drinking themselves out of baseball, but this was not the case for Reiser, as far as I can tell. No evidence of that. But after the war, there was this, we were talking about the Dodgers would not approve surgery for Reiser. That became a matter of contention, and then also salary, because Branch Rickey, great man in many ways, but he was known for being notoriously cheap, wouldn't give Reiser more than, Reiser never even made $20,000 in a season. And after the war, there were players making 50, 60, and DiMaggio eventually made 100. In 1946, the Mexican League, you may know that the Mexican League launched these raids on American players, trying to get them to come down to Mexico. And there were several, maybe not superstars, but high profile players who took the bait and went to Mexico for a year or two. The Mexican League offered Reiser $100,000 3-year contract if he would jump. Rickey was so alarmed that he flew from Brooklyn to St. Louis, where the Dodgers were playing, to talk Reiser out of jumping. And Reiser, in the end, didn't jump. And Rickey compensated him with a raise of $2,500 eventually. And this was, Pete kind of, he was a little bit ambivalent about that. He actually, I have a quote in the book where he said, imagine $100,000. Imagine taking $2,500 instead of $100,000. But to be fair, the Mexican League did sort of not collapse, but most of the American players did come back because the conditions down there were so poor. Let me pause again here. Does anyone else have other questions or comments?
And I have something. First off, I wanted to know if you thought that Reiser, looking at his stats in that great 1941 season, he also led the league in hit by pitch. Did he have the potential to be another Pete Rose?
He was better than Pete Rose. He was faster. He had an equal, if not better, batting eye. He had a better throwing arm. He was also versatile like Rose. You know, he could play different positions. Mainly he played left and center field, but he played a little bit of third base too. There was a difference though. Now Rose was very aggressive. I mean, I think everybody here has seen, or if they didn't see it live, the film of Reiser smashing into Ray Fosse at the end of the 1970 All-Star game. But Rose, when he crashed into people, he crashed into catchers. He picked fights with shortstops for the New York Mets. He didn't run into walls. Reiser, he may have crashed into a player here and there, but mainly he wasn't aggressive, he was reckless. And that was why Rose, you know, he preserved himself, played into his 40s, and had the Hall of Fame, or he would have been a Hall of Fame career. And Reiser burned out after the age of 28.
It was because because of the injuries.
Yeah, because of the injuries. That's why he was too beat up to play much after the age of 28. He was just
Rose was durable. Nothing could stop Rose. He was durable. He was like you said, he just kept himself in such great shape.
Yeah.
You made another comment. Sorry to too much about 1947. How did Reiser react to Jackie Robinson?
I'm glad you asked that because I did some reporting in the book about that. I mean, you probably have all heard the story about the Dodgers passing around the petition, or some of the Dodgers, Dixie Walker, Eddie Stanky, Kirby Higbee, passing around a petition in spring training 1947 to keep Robinson off the team. And you may have heard the story about how they took it to Pee Wee Reese, and Reese said, hey, you know, they approached him because they thought he was from Kentucky and he would be sympathetic. And Reese said, no, that Robinson has a right to play here. But they also approached Pete Reiser. And Reiser, who was from Missouri, the border state, so to speak, he also said no. And in fact, he told them a story about how when his daughter was sick, when he was on one of the Army bases, he took his daughter to a black doctor, and the doctor gave her a shot of penicillin. And, you know, and I think he asked Dixie Walker, if that had been your daughter, would you walk away from that doctor? And Dixie Walker said, yes, I would have. But Reiser said, well, then you're a goddamn fool, and refused to sign the petition. And once Robinson joined the team, it would be false to say that Reiser or any of the Dodgers treated him as a friend that first season. But I did find some comments and some anecdotes where Reiser was clearly pro Robinson and at least friendly to him. He actually Reiser brought his father over to Robinson because his dad wanted to meet him. So he reacted very positively. Oh, and well, there's more in the book. I don't want to go on too long about this, but yes, very pro Robinson. somebody asked, wait. Oh, how about Ken Griffey Jr. as a comp? Griffey Jr. Yeah, Pete Reiser and Griffey Jr. are fairly comparable. Griffey Jr. had more power, but in every other way, I think they were very comparable. And again, this is in the book, but Griffey played the outfield walls completely different than Pete Reiser. Griffey was very smart about it. He got very good instruction from his father, obviously, and strangely enough, from Willie Stargell of the Pirates, who was not known as like a great defensive player, but apparently really knew what he was doing, and gave Griffey instructions about how to approach the wall and how to play off the wall. And so Griffey, when he saw a wall coming, he would put his hands up to protect. He would catch the ball first, and then he would put his hands up to cushion the blow to stop the impact. And he was talking once on MLB Network about how you always counted the number of steps to the warning track, and examine the walls before game time so you could look for any quirks. And of course, the walls were completely different by the time Griffey came along. They were padded. There was a warning track. Sometimes the walls, they're set up in panels, so they'll fall away if you hit them too hard. And when Reiser played, none of this was in place. In fact, Reiser was the reason that the Dodgers, both in Brooklyn and Los Angeles, put padding on the walls to protect their outfielders. They remembered what happened to Reiser. So when Reiser hit the wall, he was hitting a hard concrete wall with no padding whatsoever. And often, back in those days, there were things like flagpoles in center field, or in Yankee Stadium, where Reiser played in 2 World Series. There were monuments to Gehrig and Ruth out there. And in Cincinnati, the field sloped upward, right before the walls. It was very hazardous to play when you got into deep center field. And so that was another, reason for Reiser's downfall. Anyone else?
Dan, I came in late, so I have to apologize. Maybe you already covered this topic, but I recall reading a good number of years ago, in possibly one of the DeRocher autobiographies, but I'm not certain. But there was a discussion. The DeRocher or somebody said that what would happen if Reiser was injured, DeRocher would say, okay, I'm not going to put you in, but put on your uniform and, just hang out in the dugout, and then sooner or later, he would get Reiser into the game. And I don't know if you addressed that already, or if that was anything you came across.
We haven't talked about that yet. I'm really glad you brought it up, because one of the things I wanted to do with this book was separate fact from fiction when it came to Reiser's career. There's a famous magazine article by the great writer W.C. Hines. It's called The Rocky Road of Pistol Pete, and it's been reproduced endlessly on, you can find it easily on the internet. And that is the source of the stories about DeRocher putting him back in the game. Telling him, hey, I know you're injured, just come hang out in the dugout, and you'll just scare the other team just being in the dugout, and then sending him up to pinch hit. There are a couple stories about how after Reiser was hit by a pitch and had a concussion, how he played the next day and hit a grand slam to win the game. And then there's the one where after the 42 collision, he rejoined the team in Pittsburgh, and DeRocher sent him up to pinch hit, and he got a hit to win the game. These stories are not true, but they're not all that far off either. In 42, Reiser was back in the lineup just 6 days after slamming into the wall at Sportsman's Park. And he did actually get, I think, an RBI single in his first game back. In 41, after he was hit on the head with the pitch, he was back a week later. And let's see, and then a month later, he was playing the Dodgers were playing the Phillies, and he came up against the same pitcher, Ike Pearson, the same pitcher who had beamed him, and he did hit a grand slam off Pearson. In fact, it was an inside the park grand slam. And this, and if I could take a slight tangent here, that moment, real life moment, was used as a plot twist in the ending of a Captain America movie, a Marvel movie about 10 years ago. But no, he was not, DeRocher wasn't so reckless, and Reiser wasn't sort of reckless to put him back in the next day. And, or DeRocher didn't fool him into coming into the dugout and, and jumping into the game. Somebody asked if Reiser was at full strength, would the Dodgers had different outcomes in the 40s and the 50s when they were playing the Yankees. It's entirely possible, because the Dodgers in those years, they had a great right fielder in Carl Furillo, a great center fielder in Duke Snider, and they always had kind of a hole in left field. It was sort of the one weak spot in the field, in the lineup. And they had Andy Pafko for a couple of years, and they later had Sandy Amoros, and I think they tried playing Jackie Robinson out there one year, but they never had a steady left fielder. Reiser could have been that left fielder, or maybe he could have played center and Snider could have played left. But yeah, if he had been at full strength, if he had been playing from 47 on through 50, 51, all the way up to 55, the Dodgers certainly could have won the World Series earlier. I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be as dramatic a story then, but they maybe would have won more world titles. Somebody asked if Reiser had a best friend on the Dodgers. It was Pee Wee Reese. In 41, the Dodgers roomed them together in spring training, and they liked each other, so much, they got along so well that they roomed on road trips from then on. And then actually during the 41 season, they roomed together at a hotel. I want to say it was called the Hotel St. George in Brooklyn, where a lot of the Dodgers stayed. And that arrangement broke up next year because both Reiser and Reese got married. They both got married in spring training of 42 on back-to-back days, and they served as best man at each other's wedding. Although now, when I talked to his daughter, Shirley Tuber, his younger daughter, she said that when he retired, his best friend was a guy named Lonnie Fry, who played for the Reds for many, many years. Fry was also from St. Louis. Let's see. Anyone else? Any other questions or comments?
Quick question.
Yeah.
You had mentioned earlier that Branch Rickey sent a letter or sent something accusing Pete of being a drinker. Where did that information come from? What basis is there? What did your research find?
I don't know where Rickey got that information. Let me tell you where I found it, the letter. Actually, there were two letters. Reiser sent one to Rickey with the request for money, and then Rickey sent the letter back. They were in Rickey's papers, which are in the Library of Congress in Washington. And so you have Reiser's letter typed on U.S. Army stationery in January of 45, and then Rickey's response probably like a week later. You could tell he wrote it out. He dictated something to his secretary because it's all in shorthand, and then the secretary typed up the letter.
On Dodger stationery.
On Dodger stationery, yeah. But I don't know where Rickey ever found that, where he got that information from, and I don't think it's true.
Thank you.
Yeah. Somebody else?
Dan, did you ever come across a story about how the Yankees were interested in him playing third base for them, and kind of a what if thing, that if they would have traded for him, he would never have had these concussions and things like that? Did you ever come across that story?
Yeah. In spring training of 39, when Reiser got on base 11 times in a row, the Yankees, he also played some games against the Yankees, and Joe McCarthy, the manager for the Yankees, told Reiser that, hey, we're trying to acquire you now.
Okay.
because the Dodgers had nobody at that time, no players of any import, and so the Yankees certainly had an excess of players that they could have given, and so supposedly they offered like 3 players or 5 players to get Reiser, but Larry McPhail, the Dodgers GM, could not make the deal because at that time he was still locked into the gentleman's agreement he had made with Branch Rickey. Rickey was the GM of the Cardinals, who had lost Reiser when Landis freed all the free agents. So, he couldn't. But McCarthy was very complimentary of Reiser's abilities. And actually, I found, Leo DeRocher has gone down in the history as being the big promoter of Pete Reiser. But I found several other managers, Casey Stengel, Bill McKechnie, Hall of Fame, who's a Hall of Fame guy for the Reds, Joe McCarthy, Frankie Frisch, who was a Hall of Fame guy for the Cardinals and the Pirates. They all were just amazed at Reiser's talent. And they all predicted he would be a great player for years to come before the injuries.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Somebody asked, who would the current player, the best comp be for Reiser, and what his stats would have looked like if he had been healthy? His stats, I think his stats would have looked something like Jackie Robinson's. High average, moderate power, a lot of stolen bases, a lot of runs scored, a lot of doubles and triples. When he actually played, now he didn't have a high RBI total on the 41 Dodgers, even though he led the league in hitting and it was hitting third. And I actually looked into this. Did he not hit with runners on base? He actually did hit with runners on base. But that year, the Dodgers batted Pee Wee Reese leadoff, and Reese became a good hitter after the war. But that year he hit just 229. And the second hitter was Billy Herman, who got off to a hot start but slumped toward the end of the season. So when Reiser came to bat in 41 and I think 42 as well, there just weren't very many people on base. And current player, actually the guy who I thought of was Randy Arozarena for the Rays, for the Tampa Bay Rays, because he stole home, in this year's playoffs, if you saw that. And I swear I don't remember any other player recently doing a straight steal of home. I mean, if somebody can correct me, please do. Arozarena plays with that kind of excitement. I mean, he's probably not Pete's equal in terms of overall talent, but he plays with that kind of excitement. Maybe in terms of overall talent. And it's hard to think of a good match because I wanted to mention his first 2 years in the majors before he got injured, Pete was hitting 335. And other guys who've hit 335 through 2 full years in the majors, you have Ichiro Suzuki, you have Wade Boggs, you have DiMaggio, Musial, and Williams. And then I think you have to go back to Paul and Lloyd Wainer, Shoeless Joe Jackson. I mean, that's the kind of company that Reiser was walking in before he started hitting the walls. Someone said first postseason straight steal of home since Jackie in 55. So that tells you something. Robinson might have been the very best comp for Reiser. So I see we're coming up on an hour. So I don't know, Kevin, do we have to wrap it up?
We have a little wiggle room. You said you wanted to do a video.
Well, I don't know if I can do a video. I'm not sure I'm technically accomplished enough to pull that off. I'll just tell you, I have a YouTube site. Just look for my name, Dan Joseph, and I have a bunch of baseball videos on there. And one of them is a video about Reiser's career and what his contemporaries were saying about him, including announcers and other great players. And I also have some other videos. Last year, I found, if I could quickly transition to my other book about Lou Gehrig, I found a radio clip of Lou Gehrig saying that Babe Ruth did call his shot in the 1932 World Series. And that is on my YouTube site if you want to hear the original clip. It's from a radio show recorded just 5 days after Ruth hit the home run against the Cubs in the World Series. But if you're interested in Gehrig and the Yankees, please check out my other book, Last Ride of the Iron Horse. They're both published by Sunbury Press. You can find it on their website or you can find it on Amazon. So I'm done. If anyone has questions, comments, criticism.
Yes, please. Anyone chime in if you have anything left.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. Thanks a lot.
Oh,
And it was terrific. Enjoyed it thoroughly.
It really was.
More about it.
On behalf of the Casey Stengel chapter, I'd like to thank you very much. It really was a great presentation.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed doing this.
Okay, good night to everybody and see you next time.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much.